Every morning in the quiet mountain town of Pine Hollow, a little girl walked through the mist with 6 golden shadows at her side. She was only 6 years old, small, silent, and broken by the loss of her parents, but with a simple flick of her hand, those massive golden retrievers obeyed her every move. She didn't speak to people, not a word in 2 years, only to one soul, Murphy the old golden who never left her side. To the townsfolk, it was a miracle. To others, it was a danger. They tried to separate her from the only family she had left. But when the moment came when it mattered most, she opened her mouth and spoke the words no one expected. And what happened next changed the town, and perhaps your faith in second chances forever. In the mountain town of Pine Hollow, the mornings came wrapped in quiet. The fog would drift down from the pine-covered ridges like a slow exhale, softening every rooftop and gravel path, cloaking the world in a hush, as if the town itself were holding its breath. It was during these mist-covered hours, just after sunrise and before the shops opened, that something remarkable happened, something that made Pine Hollow unlike anywhere else. At precisely 7:00 a.m., Grace Miller appeared. She came walking out of the low fog near the old courthouse steps, her boots brushing softly against the wet stones of Main Street. She was small, no more than 6, with pale skin and long blonde hair braided down her back, a braid often loosed at the ends and tied with mismatched ribbon. Her coat, always the same navy blue with scuffed sleeves, was a size too big and buttoned unevenly, and around her, moving like sentinels of light, were 6 golden retrievers. The dogs were large and elegant, their golden coats gleaming even in the dim light. They moved in a perfect formation, 2 in front, 2 beside her, and 2 behind. Not one leash tethered them, not one collar dragged them down. They needed none. Each of them responded to Grace's every subtle shift, a glance, a tilt of the hand, the smallest nod of her chin, and the dogs adjusted their steps as if they understood not just her movements, but her silence. Murphy, the eldest of the 6, led the group. He was a 7-year-old golden retriever with a coat like honeyed wheat and a strong, deliberate gait. His face carried the wear of time in the silvering around his snout, but his posture was regal, eyes watchful. Every step paced to match Grace's stride. He was slightly larger than the others, broader at the shoulders, with a quiet confidence that made him seem more guardian than pet. The other 5 followed him instinctively, Finley the youngest and leanest, often needing a brief glance from Murphy to fall back in line. Daisy always walking slightly closer to Grace's right side. Jasper calm and steady with a small white patch under his eye. Luna, who trotted with a dancer's step. And Rufus, who carried himself like a gentle giant, big-hearted and solid. Together, they moved like one being, golden, silent, astonishing. From behind her shop window, Mrs. Avery, the owner of Pine Hollow Florist, always paused as Grace passed. She didn't know the child. Well, few did, but she had grown used to the ritual, and somehow it comforted her. Each morning she would watch the little girl cross the square framed by mist and movement, and wonder what kind of world Grace saw through those wide, unblinking eyes. No one in town remembered exactly when the walks began. One day the girl and her dogs had simply appeared walking the streets as if they had always belonged to them. The townspeople talked about it. Of course, some admired her control. Others whispered about how she'd never spoken, not once, not even a hello or thank you. A few even expressed concern. 6 large dogs and a child barely older than kindergarten. But as days passed, then weeks, then months, the spectacle became part of Pine Hollow's rhythm, like the chiming of the town hall bell or the smell of cinnamon rolls from the bakery on 3rd Street. And then came Rebecca Hart. Rebecca had moved to Pine Hollow only 4 days earlier. She wasn't from the mountains. Her accent was crisp, her shoes too clean, her brown trench coat more suited for autumn streets in Boston than muddy walks near pine forests. She was in her mid-30s, tall and angular, with shoulder-length auburn hair that she often tucked into a knit cap. Her eyes, a pale gray, missed nothing. To most, she had introduced herself simply as a writer, working on a long-form piece, she'd said. Sipping coffee at the diner on her second morning, looking for quiet. But she was more than that. Rebecca had once been an investigative journalist, known for her tenacity in tracing human stories through bureaucratic fog. She had left the city with more than just a notebook. She carried scars, too. Some old, some fresh, all hidden beneath calm observation. That particular morning, standing beneath the rusted street lamp across from the general store, Rebecca caught her first uninterrupted glimpse of Grace, and she stared. The girl didn't look around, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge the baker who left a bowl of water out each day. She simply walked silent, centered in a moving halo of golden fur, moving through fog like a memory you couldn't quite reach. There was a poise to her, something deliberate, almost ceremonial. It was not the walk of a lost child or even a brave one. It was something different. Controlled ancient quiet in a way that wasn't empty, but sacred. Rebecca pulled a small notebook from her pocket and wrote a single sentence: "A child walks 6 golden retrievers without a word. Who taught her how to do that?" As Grace passed the town square fountain, dry this time of year, Rebecca took a step forward, meaning to follow. Not too closely, just enough to observe. But then she paused. Something in her gut pulled tight that old instinct from years of field reporting. This wasn't a moment to chase. This was a moment to listen. Grace walked on her boots, tapping gently against the stone, the dogs parting slightly as they passed an old man with a cane. The man tipped his hat. Grace didn't see it. By the time she turned the corner near the library, disappearing into the thickening fog, Rebecca realized she hadn't breathed in over a minute. Pine Hollow had a story, and Rebecca Hart, whether she meant to or not, had just found its first sentence. By mid-morning, the mist had begun to lift over the hills of Pine Hollow, revealing a crisp sky the color of washed denim. The sun still low, caught in the tops of the pines, lighting up the frost-dusted needles like scattered silver. At the edge of the southern ridge, just beyond the edge of town, sat the old Miller cottage, its white paint faded to gray, its chimney gently puffing smoke into the cold air. A small vegetable garden lay dormant beneath a tarp, and along the porch rail, 3 clay pots held hardy winter pansies that refused to wilt. Grace Miller climbed the porch steps silently flanked by the 6 golden silhouettes that never left her side. As they reached the top, the dogs peeled away instinctively to their respective places. Finley circling once before settling near the boot tray, Daisy waiting patiently for the door to open, Jasper stretching out on the porch boards. Murphy as always lingered beside. Grace Murphy was 7 broad in the chest and a little slower than he had been the year before. His fur was still thick and sunlit gold, but white now, traced his eyebrows and curled in patches around his legs. His movements were deliberate not out of frailty, but wisdom. Every step he took was measured. He never barked unnecessarily. If Grace was still, Murphy was still. If she turned, he turned with her. Inside the cottage, the air was warm and smelled faintly of tea and wood smoke. Grace removed her coat and boots, placing them neatly by the door. One by one, the dogs filed in behind her, each waiting their turn, each knowing the order. The kitchen, small and square, opened into the family room, where a worn green recliner faced the window. In it sat Walter Miller. Walter, Grace's grandfather, was a tall man once, but time had curved his spine and slowed his steps. His hair, what little remained, was white and close-cropped. His hands were large and freckled veins rising like vines beneath translucent skin. He wore thick wool socks and a button-down shirt. With the cuffs rolled back, a newspaper lay across his lap, mostly unread. He looked up as Grace entered. "She's back," he said aloud, more for himself than anyone else. He smiled faintly, Murphy leading again. Grace nodded once. She crossed to the wooden feeding stand by the back wall and began portioning out food into 6 bowls. The sound of kibble tumbling was the only noise in the room. Each dog waited, not moving, until Grace tapped their shoulder gently. Then, and only then, would they eat. From the hallway, Margaret Miller emerged carrying a laundry basket. Her thin frame moved with practiced economy, every motion efficient. Her short silver-streaked hair was pulled back with a clip, and her cardigan sleeves were dusted with flour from baking. Earlier that morning, Margaret's face bore the kind of stillness that came not from serenity, but survival. She had aged sharply in the last 2 years, especially since the accident. The accident had changed everything. Mark and Elise Miller, Grace's parents, had been driving back from a training session at their dog behavior center just outside town. The snow had fallen early that evening, slicking the ridge road. A pickup ran a red light. The crash killed them instantly. Grace, then 4, had been in the back seat. When emergency responders arrived, it was Murphy who met them, barking at the edge of the road, circling the wreck. He had pulled Grace from the back seat and kept her warm, pressing his body against hers until help arrived. She had not spoken a word since that night. Therapists called it selective mutism. Trauma-linked silence. She could speak, her vocal cords were fine, but something in her had sealed shut. Over time, even her tears became rare. She smiled sometimes, nodded often, but her voice had vanished into the pine-covered hills. Now it was the dogs who filled the space where words once lived. Walter lowered his paper. I ever tell you, Murphy came from a police litter. Margaret, placing folded towels in the cabinet, replied without looking up. Twice last week. He was supposed to be a K9, Walter mused. Didn't like sirens, too gentle. Mark said that was his best quality. Grace, seated on the floor now, was brushing Jasper with slow rhythmic strokes. She worked in silence, not out of reluctance, but reverence. Each dog received the same care, grooming, feeding, rest. They were not pets to her, they were kin. The house's back room had once been Elise's office, but now it belonged to Grace. The walls were lined with shelves stacked with worn training journals, laminated behavior charts, clickers, leashes, and chew toys. Mark had kept obsessive records notes on canine body language, response timing, individualized cues. Grace had memorized them all. She had also added her own annotations, drawings, gestures. Her invented hand signals, copied into neat rows in colored pencil. At night, Margaret would sometimes find her under a blanket in the attic, flashlight in hand. Flipping through those old notebooks like sacred texts, Murphy usually sat beside her head, resting on her thigh. That afternoon, Walter sat at the window watching frost melt from the edge of the bird feeder. You know, he said quietly to Margaret, I think she's teaching them new commands. Ones. Mark never wrote down, she's 6. Margaret replied, glancing at Grace in the other room. She shouldn't have to. But she does. Walter paused, and they follow her. Margaret didn't answer. She stood in the archway watching her granddaughter guide Luna through a new movement. 3 taps of the finger, followed by a slow circle of the wrist. Luna sat, turned, then lay down. Grace smiled softly and rubbed the dog's ears. Walter leaned back in his chair. She talks to them. Not with words, but they understand. Margaret's voice dropped. They're all she's got. The sun dipped behind the ridge as our evening approached, casting long blue shadows across the living room. Grace curled up on the couch with Murphy pressed against her feet. The others rested nearby, breathing in a harmony that had become the house's lullaby. Outside, the first stars blinked awake. By the end of her first week in Pine Hollow, Rebecca Hart had learned the rhythm of the town, who opened their shops early, who swept their stoops without fail, who nodded politely, and who asked too many questions. But nothing stirred up curiosity like the child who walked silently with 6 golden retrievers each morning. Rebecca had taken to waking before dawn, always dressed in the same charcoal gray coat, camera slung loosely over her shoulder, and a notebook folded in her back pocket. She never followed too closely, never wanted to startle the girl or draw attention. But she had questions, always questions. That morning, Grace passed beneath the eaves of Delaney's hardware store, just as the shopkeeper himself arrived. Frank Delaney was a broad man in his early 60s with heavy shoulders and thinning white hair, always dressed in a red flannel shirt, tucked into dusty jeans. He greeted every customer with a grunt that meant everything from good morning to don't break anything. As Grace passed with Murphy in front, Frank paused mid-step, his hand resting on the doorknob. They're better behaved than my nephews, he muttered to Rebecca, who had paused a few feet away. Girl doesn't say a word, but those dogs know exactly what to do. It's something else. Rebecca scribbled a note. Do you know the family well? Only in passing, Frank replied, unlocking the shop door. Mark used to come in for screws and wood glue. Good man, his wife too. Quiet folks raise good dogs. Sad business. He didn't elaborate. Rebecca didn't press. In Pine Hollow. Sadness was something most people wore without naming. Across the street, a woman peered through her blinds. Her name was Judith Pomeroy. In her early 70s, she had once been the principal of Pine Hollow Elementary, and though she had retired a decade earlier, she still carried herself with the unyielding posture of someone used to telling others how to behave. Judith was tall and thin, with sharp features and iron gray hair always pulled into a bun. Her lips pressed into a line as she watched the child and her dogs pass. Judith had never approved of unstructured things, loose shoelaces, unpredictable weather, or children outside without supervision. To her, the sight of a silent girl walking 6 large animals without an adult nearby was not beautiful. It was negligent. Later that day, Rebecca found herself seated at a corner table in the Pine Hollow Cafe, a cozy place that smelled of burnt cinnamon and brewed comfort. She nursed a second cup of coffee while flipping through her notes when a woman approached her table. "Are you the one asking questions about the Miller girl?" The woman was in her late 40s, wearing a lavender scarf and a skeptical expression. Her name was Elaine Burns, chair of the Pine Hollow PTA. Her eyes were narrow and pale green, and she had the tone of someone who never quite trusted what she couldn't control. "I'm a writer," Rebecca replied, "working on a human interest piece about the town." "Well, there's human interest and then there's interference," Elaine said, setting her coffee down with a pointed clink. "Some of us are concerned that child walks those dogs alone. No. Adult supervision, no speech, no schooling, far as I can tell." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Have there been any incidents?" Elaine shook her head. "Not yet. But that's not the point. It's a public safety concern. Large dogs, unpredictable behavior. What if she trips? What if one of them gets spooked? We've seen it before." Rebecca took note of the plural. "Who else feels this way?" Elaine leaned in slightly. "Judith Pomeroy, Margaret Wilson, a few others. We're drafting a petition. It's not about being cruel. It's about being responsible." Rebecca didn't argue. She'd learned long ago that pushing too early only made people dig in deeper. But inside her gut twisted. There was something about the way Grace carried herself, about the orderliness of those morning walks, that seemed to contradict everything Elaine was saying. Still, Rebecca knew the power of perception, and perception in a town like Pine Hollow could become action overnight. Later that evening, the town's community board near the library began displaying a new flyer. It was printed neatly in black and white, with no names attached, only a general heading. "Concerned citizens of Pine Hollow request local review of unattended child walking large animals in public spaces." Rebecca read it without surprise. She had seen towns turn inward like this before, like a body trying to reject something unfamiliar. What surprised her, though, was how quickly the paper had spread. By the following morning, copies appeared on the bulletin board in the grocery store, outside the pharmacy, even near the school gates. Meanwhile, Grace continued her walks, unbothered, unchanged. One morning, she passed a small group of people outside the bakery. Margaret Wilson, a retired librarian with a fondness for pastel sweaters and blunt opinions, whispered something to her friend as Grace went by. Grace didn't turn her head, but Murphy's ears flicked back and his tail lowered just slightly. Rebecca, watching from the other side of the square, noticed that afternoon Rebecca visited Luis Mendoza, the baker in his shop. Luis was a soft-spoken man in his 50s with warm brown eyes and a rolling laugh. He had run the bakery since his early 20s, inheriting it from his uncle, and his pastries were legendary through the valley. He also happened to be one of the few adults Grace acknowledged regularly. "I leave biscuits for the dogs," he said, gesturing toward a jar behind the counter. "She never takes anything herself, but she always nods." Murphy picks it up. "Never makes a mess. They're cleaner than my regulars." "Do you think she's in danger?" Rebecca asked. Luis grew serious. "No, I think she's healing in the only way she knows how. People don't like what they can't explain. But those dogs, especially Murphy, they'd protect her with their lives. I've seen it." Rebecca didn't take notes this time. She just nodded, then stepped outside to watch the last light of afternoon fall across the town. That evening, at a small town meeting in the community center basement, the petition was officially submitted to the local council. It wasn't long or complicated, just a call for investigation into the welfare of the Miller child. But it didn't need to be complicated, just loud enough. And it had begun. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, painting Pine Hollow in long golden beams that sliced through pine needles and danced across rooftops. The snow had melted in patches, leaving behind small rivulets along the gutters and the smell of thawed earth. Rebecca Hart stood at the end of a gravel driveway, her boots damp from the morning melt, staring at the weathered white cottage at the ridge's edge. She hesitated, her hand brushing over the notebook in her coat pocket, not to pull it out, but to remind herself that she was here not just as a journalist, but as something more complex. The Miller home looked as it had the first time she'd seen it, modest, worn, and quietly dignified. The porch sagged a little in the middle, and the wind chimes above the door sang in uneven rhythms. But the yard was clean, the dog bowls lined up in neat rows, and the front steps swept free of leaves. There was intention in that order, care not neglect. Margaret Miller opened the door after the second knock. She looked thinner than she had the week before, her cardigan buttoned tight around her narrow shoulders, silver gray hair tucked into a low twist. Her eyes, a soft hazel, held a mixture of suspicion and weariness. But she stepped aside without a word, and Rebecca entered. Inside the house smelled faintly of tea and wood smoke. The walls were decorated with old photographs, weddings, picnics, dogs at various ages, and faded paperbacks lined a sagging shelf near the fireplace. Grace sat cross-legged on the carpet in the living room, surrounded by the 6 golden retrievers. They were not sprawled casually like household pets, but positioned with quiet attention, all facing her, their eyes steady and waiting. Rebecca paused in the threshold. Grace didn't look up, but Murphy did. The dog lifted his head, his gaze sharp and intelligent. Watching Rebecca with the focused calm of a sentinel, Murphy's fur had thinned slightly around the muzzle, and a faint scar ran across his left front leg. A white line of memory that Margaret later explained came from the crash. At 7, Murphy carried the solemn weight of a creature who had witnessed more than most people would ever understand. "She won't speak," Margaret said quietly, following Rebecca's gaze. "But if you're patient, she might let you listen." Rebecca sat gently on the far edge of the couch, careful not to invade the invisible perimeter around Grace. One of the younger dogs, Finley she would later learn, shifted his body slightly, placing himself between her and the girl. "No threat, buddy," Rebecca murmured. She watched for several minutes in silence. Grace was holding a laminated card with color-coded signals, some adapted from standard service dog hand cues, others entirely unique. She tapped 2 fingers to her palm and made a small sweeping motion with her wrist. Murphy rose, padded over to the window, and sat beside it, watching the yard. Another motion, and Daisy rolled over playfully, earning a faint smile from Grace. Margaret brought tea without asking and set it down beside Rebecca. She sat in the recliner across from them, her hands folded in her lap. "My son," she said softly, "was meticulous with records. Every dog had a file. He used color-coded charts, learned behavior, conditioning from Temple Grandin's books." Grace found the files after the funeral. That was when she stopped crying. Rebecca glanced down at the girl again. "She studies them, memorized them." Margaret replied, then rewrote them in her own hand. "She uses those journals like scripture." "And Murphy," she nodded toward the dog, now standing guard near the window. "He's more than her protector. He's the last voice of her father." She can still hear Rebecca's throat tightened. She had no children of her own, had never wanted any. Not really, but in Grace she saw a quiet defiance she recognized, a refusal to let trauma erase the self. She stared into her tea for a moment, watching the way the steam twisted in the light, and then asked, "Has anyone tried to remove the dogs?" Margaret didn't look up. "Judith Pomeroy left a note on our mailbox last week. Something about supervision and leash laws." She copied town ordinance numbers by hand. Would she push it? Judith Margaret's voice held no bitterness, only exhaustion. She once sent a child home for wearing socks that didn't match the school dress code. Of course she would, Rebecca nodded. She knew the type. Walter entered the room a few minutes later, slowly with the aid of a cane. He was tall, though time had bent his shoulders. He wore a brown cardigan over a checked shirt, and his face lit up slightly when he saw Rebecca. "You're the reporter, huh?" he said, with a grin settling into his chair. "I am," she replied, "though I'm trying to keep that quiet." "Well, that won't work here," Walter chuckled. "This town sees everything." Grace stood up silently, placing a hand on Murphy's head. The dog looked up at her, then followed as she stepped out of the living room toward the back hallway. The others trailed behind her in order, moving with military grace. Only Finley lingered a moment before following, glancing back once at Rebecca as if in warning. When they were gone, Rebecca asked, "Have any professionals evaluated their behavior?" "A behaviorist came 6 months ago," Margaret said. "She said she'd never seen anything like it. Said separating them could do more damage than good." Rebecca hesitated. Then unprompted she said, "My father used to say silence meant disobedience. He'd scream just to fill the space. I learned how to go quiet so he couldn't find something to punish." Grace's silence isn't absence. It's the only safe place she's got left. Margaret looked at her for a long time, then said simply, "Thank you." When Rebecca left, an hour later, the sun was starting to dip behind the hills. Murphy stood on the porch watching her car roll down the gravel. Grace stood beside him, her small hand resting on his shoulder. Unmoving, Rebecca pulled over, halfway down the road, stepped out and leaned against the car door. For the first time in years, she let herself cry. Not from sadness, but from recognition. The line between pain and peace was thin. She realized, and sometimes it was shaped like a girl who didn't speak, and a dog who never needed her to. The morning began like any other, with frost feathering the window panes and birdsong muted by the dense pine forest that bordered the east side of Pine Hollow. Grace had risen before the sun, as usual, and fed the dogs while the house still slept. Her routine was sacred, precise, quiet, full of intention. After breakfast, she had slipped on her navy coat and red wool mittens, then tapped Murphy gently on the shoulder. It was their signal. The others knew what it meant. The pack was going out. But that day, instead of turning toward the town square, Grace veered down the side path leading into the woods, the trail her father used to take when testing the dogs on terrain. Murphy hesitated, then followed his tail. Steady one by one, the others trailed behind, and they disappeared into the whispering firs like golden ghosts. The path along Miller's Ridge was narrow and slick from melted frost. It wound between trees with roots like knotted ropes and sloped gently toward a shallow ravine. Grace walked with steady steps, not in haste, not in fear, just calm, focused exploration. Murphy stayed close eyes darting between Grace's feet and the shadows ahead. They had walked that trail dozens of times, but something about this morning, maybe a patch of ice, maybe a stray stone, shifted everything. Grace's boots slipped as she reached the bend near a low rock wall, and in an instant, she was gone. She tumbled down the embankment with a thud and a cry, her hand missing a tree branch by inches. Murphy barked once sharply, then bounded after her. The fall wasn't far, only 8 feet, but Grace landed hard between 2 stones. Her ankle twisted and her coat snagged on a root. She whimpered, her face contorted in pain, but she made no sound loud enough for the woods to carry. Murphy circled her, licking her face, nudging her shoulder. She tried to sit up, but winced and collapsed again. Murphy stood over her a moment longer. Then he turned and sprinted back the way they had come. Meanwhile, Rebecca Hart was finishing her morning coffee at Luis Mendoza's bakery, seated by the window as always when the front door burst open and a boy no older than 11 shouted, "Miss Hart, something's wrong with the Miller girl." The boy, Dylan Cooper, was short and wiry with a mop of dark hair and a messenger bag full of hand-drawn comics. He lived on the north end of town and spent most afternoons sketching superheroes behind the post office. He had seen Grace walking into the woods earlier with her dogs and thought nothing of it until Murphy came sprinting back into view, barking madly and dragging Grace's scarf in his mouth. He wouldn't stop barking. Dylan panted. "He came right up to me like he wanted me to follow him. I think something happened." Rebecca didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and was out the door in seconds, her boots crunching over gravel. As Dylan pointed the way toward Miller's Ridge, Luis followed with his phone, already dialing 911. The trail to the ravine was steep and narrow, but Murphy led them with precision, barking at the key turns, glancing back to make sure they followed. When they reached the ledge, they saw her. Grace lay crumpled among the roots and stone. Her eyes were open, but her face was pale, and her lower legs sat at an odd angle. Daisy and Luna flanked her protectively. The others paced the edges above. Rebecca climbed down, first slipping only once on a slick rock, and knelt beside the girl. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're here. Help's coming." Grace didn't respond, but her eyes locked on Murphy, who was now whining softly, tail low, pacing in agitation. 15 minutes later, the Pine Hollow Volunteer Rescue Team arrived headed by Officer James Connolly, a man in his early 40s with salt and pepper stubble and a permanently creased forehead. He had served in Iraq and had a calm, no-nonsense air about him. Today he wore a windbreaker over his uniform and spoke in steady tones. They secured Grace's leg with a temporary splint and carried her up the incline on a rescue stretcher. Murphy stayed so close that Connolly eventually let him walk alongside them, one paw gently resting on the corner of the canvas as they moved. That afternoon, after Grace was taken to St. Mary's Clinic for x-rays, Rebecca uploaded a short video to her website. The footage came from Dylan's phone. It showed Murphy running back through the forest, Grace's scarf in his mouth, barking and turning to guide the boy like a trained responder. Within hours, the video had gone viral. The story, Hero Dog Saves, Silent Girl. After Fall in the Woods was picked up by regional news, The footage was played on the evening news in Boston, then syndicated across smaller networks. Online hashtags began to spread. Orange que Murphy, the hero, Jack Grace and Murphy, your golden guardians. Judith Pomeroy's petition, which had quietly gained over 100 signatures the week before, began to receive backlash. Locals who had once hesitated now spoke up in support of Grace and her dogs. "He's not just a dog," Luis Mendoza told a TV reporter who came to film the bakery, Murphy's her family. He knew exactly what to do. Even Officer Connolly, typically media averse, gave a brief statement. "I've worked with trained canines my whole career. What I saw today went beyond obedience. That was loyalty, intelligence, love." The town, divided just days before, found itself humbled by a girl's silence and the voice her dog had lent her in crisis. Back at the Miller home, Margaret sat beside Grace's bed, her granddaughter's foot now elevated and wrapped in bandages. Walter rested nearby with a book in hand. Though he hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes, Murphy lay beside the bed, unmoving, except for the occasional flick of his tail. Grace reached out with her good hand, fingers brushing against his ear. He nuzzled her palm, sighing deeply. And though she did not speak, the way her eyes shone when they met Margaret's told the whole story. They didn't need words. They had each other. The Pine Hollow Town Hall was filled to its wooden rafters, the cold winter light filtering in through tall windows that had seen generations of town meetings, weddings, and farewells. Today the room buzzed with something heavier, uncertainty. At the front sat a three-person council flanked by folders, water glasses, and an old microphone that occasionally crackled with static. The center seat belonged to Mayor Trudy Lamont, a square-faced woman with short silver hair and a voice used to silencing crowded rooms. The hearing had been called in response to a petition submitted weeks earlier, a formal request for review of the living conditions of Grace Miller, the 6-year-old girl who walked every morning through town with 6 large golden retrievers and did not speak. The viral video of Murphy, her oldest dog, leading rescuers to her after she fell into a ravine had touched hearts across the country. But for some in town, it raised questions rather than answers. Could a mute child be considered safe living under the care of 2 elderly grandparents? Could a pack of 6 large dogs be reliably controlled by someone so young and silent? These were not easy questions, and Pine Hollow was a place where hard questions weren't asked lightly. Margaret and Walter Miller sat near the front, Grace between them. The child wore her usual navy coat and corduroy leggings. Her brace had been removed earlier that week. Murphy sat by her feet, calm and steady in his navy vest. Grace clutched a leather-bound notebook. She did not look around. Mayor Lamont cleared her throat. "This session is to gather testimony and insight. No decisions will be made today, but all statements will be entered into record." The first to speak was Rebecca Hart. She wore a charcoal blazer and boots still dusted with dirt from her walk to town. She stood steady-voiced but deliberate. "I've been observing Grace for several weeks," she said. "Not as a case, as a person. What I've seen isn't a child in danger. I've seen structure, consistency, and a kind of bond between girl and dog that borders on intuitive. Murphy doesn't just obey. He responds. The others follow Grace not because she dominates them, but because they trust her." She paused. "This isn't chaos, it's communication, just not the kind we're used to." Next came Dr. Lyle Hammond, a veterinary behaviorist from the county. He was a tall man in his 50s with kind eyes and a cardigan, 2 sizes too big. "I've examined all 6 dogs over the last month," he began. "They are in excellent health, well fed, responsive, and display no signs of aggression or anxiety. Grace's control over them is not verbal, but physical and gestural. That in itself is not unusual in advanced canine work." He shifted slightly. "Murphy, the lead dog is functioning at the level of a trained medical alert animal. I witnessed him interrupt Grace's movement before a fainting spell during one of our sessions. That isn't coincidence, it's response to biosignals." A few murmurs rippled across the room. Dr. Hammond concluded, "There is risk as there is in any dynamic involving large animals. But in this case, I believe the dogs are not a risk to Grace, they are the mitigation of one." After him, a woman named Claire Riggins took the stand. She was a child therapist based in nearby Bedford, with curly red hair and a warm scarf wrapped twice around her neck. She had been observing Grace through video and indirect sessions authorized by the family. "Grace presents traits common in post-traumatic mutism," Claire explained. "She does not display signs of cognitive delay. She reads, writes, understands instructions. What's remarkable is that she has built an entire behavioral vocabulary using nonverbal cues, primarily with the dogs. This may not fit the standard child development chart, but it is functioning. Grace is coping in the only language she has left. Removing those dogs, especially Murphy, would likely sever the only stable emotional tether she has maintained since her trauma. Luis Mendoza, the baker, followed. "They walk past my store every morning," he said simply. "Never once have those dogs done anything reckless. They sit when she stops. They drink only when she gestures. I've seen adults less in control of themselves than Grace is of those dogs." Then came Officer James Connolly. His testimony was short and practical. "I've worked with K-9 units for 18 years. I've seen what discipline and trust look like. Grace has both. The morning she fell, Murphy didn't just bark. He found help, guided it back, and kept everyone safe. That's not an accident. That's partnership." No one spoke for a long moment after he sat down. At the end of the hearing, Mayor Lamont folded her hands, her voice quiet. What this hearing presents is a contradiction. On paper, this situation defies our traditional understanding of what guardianship and child safety look like. And yet, what we've seen through witness accounts and expert evaluations is a system, an unorthodox one, but a system that works for this child. She turned toward Grace, who still had not spoken. The girl slowly opened her notebook and held it up. A simple sentence written in large, careful print. "They help me stay alive." Murphy placed his paw gently on her knee, and in that moment, no one in the room could argue with her. The wind outside Pine Hollow's town hall rustled through the bare trees like distant murmurs, as if the forest itself were listening in. Inside, silence had fallen again, heavier than the air and twice as still. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask to be broken. It waited tense, poised, expecting something sacred. At the front of the room, Grace stood. Her small frame looked even smaller against the backdrop of the hearing chamber, her coat sleeves too long and her shoes slightly scuffed. Her hair, a tangled curtain of ash blonde, fell across her face. In one hand, she still clutched the worn notebook that had carried her voice through these last weeks. But today she didn't lift it. Her other hand rested gently atop Murphy's broad head. The dog stood motionless, his amber eyes scanning the crowd before returning to Grace. Behind them sat Walter and Margaret Miller, frozen in place. Rebecca stood a few feet back, heart thudding so loudly she could feel it in her throat. No one moved, no one breathed too loud. Grace raised her eyes to the council, first to Mayor Trudy Lamont, then briefly to Councilman Greg Yates, whose gruff skepticism had echoed across town in earlier meetings. Finally, she looked at Marlene Fisher, the soft-spoken clerk with a notepad always in motion. And then it happened. "Don't take them," Grace said, barely more than a whisper. "They saved me." Her voice, small, rasped by disuse, edged with something raw and luminous, broke across the chamber like sunrise cracking through cloud. The words floated into the stillness, and something in the room broke. Not apart, but open. Murphy pressed closer to her side. Margaret gasped quietly. Walter blinked hard and squeezed his wife's hand. Rebecca stared not in disbelief, but in reverence. In the second row, even Judith Pomeroy, rigid and well-pressed in her deep burgundy blazer, lowered her eyes. Mayor Lamont's hand trembled as it reached for her microphone. "Thank you, Grace," she said gently. "That was very brave." Grace nodded once, then stepped back and sat beside Murphy, one hand still tangled in his fur. The dogs gathered around her like sentinels. But today they didn't shield her. They supported her shoulders to shoulders as if standing guard, not from danger, but from disbelief. The mayor adjusted her reading glasses. Her voice, when it came, was measured and resolute. After reviewing the reports from our experts, the testimony from community members, and most importantly, the direct expression from Grace herself, the council has come to a unanimous decision. She looked up, letting the pause sink in. "We find no grounds for intervention in the current custody arrangement. Grace Miller will remain under the care of her grandparents, Walter and Margaret Miller." A quiet exhale rippled through the room. However, Mayor Lamont continued, in light of public concern and the unique circumstances of this case, "We will implement a community-supported monitoring system. This will not be a punitive measure, but one of support, regular wellness checks, collaboration with veterinary and therapy professionals, and a volunteer rotation to assist the Miller household when needed." She looked to Grace again, her eyes gentler now. This community is not here to take your voice away. We're here to help you find it again, however you choose to use it. Applause did not erupt. That would have felt wrong. Instead, there was something quieter, more powerful. A soft thrum of agreement, a collective moment of pride, of recognition. Pine Hollow, for all its stubborn traditions, knew Grace when it saw it, and they had just witnessed it, capital and lowercase. After the meeting, people approached quietly. Luis Mendoza handed Margaret a wrapped box of cinnamon rolls without saying a word. Officer Connolly gave Walter a nod that said more than pages of testimony. Even Elaine Burns, who had once questioned Grace's safety with the dogs, placed a hand on Murphy's head and whispered, "Good boy." Outside, snow had begun to fall, thin flakes swirling slowly like confetti at the edge of a celebration. Grace stood on the top step of Town Hall, the 6 dogs encircling her like constellations. She looked not at the crowd, but at the sky where flakes melted against her lashes. Rebecca stepped beside her, her voice low. "You did something beautiful today." Grace didn't respond with words. She didn't need to. Murphy leaned into her leg and Grace smiled, and that was enough. A full year had passed since the day Grace Miller's voice cracked through the stillness of Pine Hollow's town hall, like sunlight through frost-covered glass. Spring had returned this time earlier, with crocuses blooming at the feet of pine trees and golden dandelions scattered like confetti across town yards. But the real bloom, the most tender and unexpected, had happened within Grace herself. She now walked the same morning route through the square, but not in silence. Her voice, though still soft, had found its rhythm. Simple greetings, soft thank yous words, to the dogs, and occasionally songs hummed under her breath as the pack followed her in formation. Murphy always at her side, the others, Daisy Luna, Finley, Rusty, and Clover, walking with the same practiced grace, but now joined by curious children and even the occasional family dog invited along for the stroll. The people of Pine Hollow no longer turned in hushed wonder as she passed. They waved, called out good mornings, and sometimes joined in. Step Grace had become part of the town's daily rhythm, and the town once divided over her now rose with her. In the months after the hearing, the Millers had been approached by Dr. Claire Riggins, the same child therapist who had testified during the inquiry. Claire, moved by Grace's progress and her unique relationship with the dogs, had proposed a new program. Something more than counseling, something that used Grace's journey not only as a symbol, but as a method. They called it Golden Words. The idea was simple children who struggled with speech due to trauma, developmental challenges, or selective mutism would work with trained golden retrievers under Grace's guidance, not as patients but as partners. The dogs became silent translators, responsive and warm, helping children express without pressure. Murphy, now 8 years old with a dignified silver streak down his snout, became the face of the program. Grace, still only 7, became its quiet heart. The sessions were held in the back room of the Pine Hollow Library, a sunlit space that once housed town archives, but now echoed with laughter, soft barks, and the scribble of crayon on construction paper. Grace helped introduce each child to the dogs, sometimes using words, sometimes gestures. Her presence alone was often enough. One little boy, Milo, who had not spoken in almost a year following the loss of his twin sister, began whispering to Clover during a quiet session. One rainy Thursday. His mother cried in the hallway, her hands over her mouth. It wasn't therapy, they said it was kinship. Grace didn't try to fix anyone, she made them feel unbroken. Rebecca Hart had documented every step. What began as a personal journey of curiosity had become a profound exploration of resilience. Her series, titled Voices Between Silence, had been syndicated by a national newspaper. It went on to win the Benton Journalism Prize for Human Interest Writing. Rebecca, who once fled her past, now stood before press audiences telling the story of a girl, a dog, and a town that found healing, not through intervention, but through listening. She never said it aloud, but she believed that Grace had also healed something in her. Watching the child reclaim her voice had helped Rebecca begin confronting her own silences, ones born of fear, ones that had kept her from love, from trust, from self-forgiveness. One Sunday morning, she stood at the edge of Grace's group in the park and whispered aloud the first line of a letter to her father. The trees didn't judge her, neither did the dogs. Murphy's legacy reached further than anyone could have predicted. The town erected a small bronze statue of him, seated ears alert at the edge of the town green where Grace had once walked past without a word. Underneath a plaque read, "To those who listen without needing sound." Tourists took photos there now. School children on field trips made crayon rubbings of the plaque. Local schools even adopted Murphy's Law of Kindness as part of their character education curriculum. It was simple: be patient, be loyal, help others find their voice. Walter and Margaret, though still aging and often tired, had found new purpose. Margaret began attending story time at the library, reading aloud. While Clover curled at her feet, Walter worked with Dr. Hammond to build a small agility course behind the Miller home for the therapy dogs in training. One evening in late April, a warm breeze stirring through the blossoming trees, Grace stood beside Murphy at the edge of the town green. A small group had gathered for the first official graduation of the Golden Words program. 5 children stood in a semicircle, each beside a golden retriever. Their families watched from picnic blankets and benches. Mayor Lamont, now softer in voice than the woman who had presided over the hearing, a year ago gave a brief speech about resilience. Then she nodded toward Grace. The girl stepped forward. She held a slip of paper in one hand, but she didn't look at it. Her voice, clear and sure, now rang out across the lawn. Sometimes, she said, words get stuck. Sometimes they hide. Dogs don't need you to explain everything. They just wait. And sometimes, they wait long enough for you to find the words again. The crowd was silent for a moment. Then came the applause, gentle then rising like the wind through leaves. Grace turned to Murphy, who blinked up at her with slow devotion. "Good boy," she whispered and smiled. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden beams across the green. It touched the edges of the statue, the trees, the children, and the girl who had once been called voiceless. But now her voice didn't just belong to her. It was a light others could follow. And behind every word, every hand, signal, every whispered thought she once had to keep inside, there stood a golden dog, loyal, watchful, and unwavering. Sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that rise from silence. Grace's journey reminds us that healing doesn't always come in loud declarations or perfect words. It can begin with a quiet whisper, a faithful companion, and the steady patience of love. In her story, we witnessed a miracle not of thunder or lightning, but of soft persistence of loyalty that never wavered, and of a child's spirit gently unfolding. It is in moments like these that we see God's hand at work, not in grand displays, but in the small golden lights that guide us back from darkness. A dog who waits, a child who dares to speak again, a town that learns to listen. These are not coincidences, they are blessings. They are the quiet miracles that happen when we open our hearts to one another. In our everyday lives, there are voices around us still, unheard people carrying invisible wounds, children who long to be understood. Let Grace and Murphy remind us to slow down, to listen to love unconditionally. May we become like those golden companions, gentle, loyal, and always ready to help someone find their voice. If this story moved your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope is real. Comment your thoughts, subscribe for more true stories of love and healing. And if you believe in the power of quiet miracles, type Amen. In the comments, may God bless you and everyone you love.